We are live. Thanks, Josh, for joining me today. I really appreciate it. I'm excited to kind of see where this conversation goes today. I think kind of where I'd like to start is just do a really quick intro for us. Tell us a little bit about yourself and in particular Fugue, and we'll go from there and just kind of see where we end up.
Yeah, sounds good. Well, Brett, thanks for having me. It's always good to talk to you. I love following your Twitter feed on all the CloudFormation stuff that you're teaching. I think that's a great resource. So yeah, my name's Josh Stella. I'm the co-founder and CEO of a company called Fugue. I'm a very CTO leaning CEO, and I kind of fill both those roles. My background is as a software architect and developer going back to the early 90s professionally. So I'm dating myself quite a bit there. I've spent my career bouncing between national security kinds of roles and high-tech kinds of roles. So when I was at AWS, I was a principal solutions architect, principally focused on the Department of Defense and, kind of related stuff. And, when Fugue got going, In-Q-Tel were early investors in us. So I've been around that space a lot. Fugue is all about just doing, Fugue is all about doing cloud security in a highly automated and easy to use way, particularly for engineers. Okay. It's really aimed at building stuff in a secure way and then keeping it secure, as opposed to security being like a add-on process at the end.
An afterthought.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, great. Well, thanks very much. And as we were chatting here before getting ready, I've been a fan of what you guys have been creating for years now. So I'm really excited to have a chat with you today. And I think your intro was perfect as a segue into really the first thing that I want to talk about. And it's an open-ended question. In your time, and I know you've been doing security for quite a while, but what would you think is probably the most common or most challenging aspect when you think about organizations, whether they've been running on a public cloud provider for some time or just getting started? What would be one of the kind of most common or challenging security issues that they typically face?
Sure. So I'm going to answer it two ways. There's a very tactical, don't do this kind of answer, this one thing, picking out one thing.
Yeah.
And then there's some more strategic or even philosophical, intellectual answer, I suppose, more abstract answer. Specifically, if I had to give one single piece of advice, it would be make sure you have bucket policies on all your S3 buckets that are the final deciding factor on who has access under what circumstances, because you cannot trust what's happening in the identity world across an organization. You need some final gating mechanism. So, okay. So that's a very, very tactical piece of advice, which is connected to this broader issue, which is TCP/IP networks and cloud aren't that important from a security perspective. So what a lot of security practitioners have spent their whole careers doing is thinking about segmentation of networks and building perimeters and all that. Cloud APIs make most of that irrelevant in many cases, or maybe put a better way, it's still relevant, but almost all the cloud breaches are not executed through TCP/IP-based permissions, ACLs, et cetera. They're done through identities. And IAM is the network now.
Yeah.
When you think about the relationship between compute instances or lambdas and databases, the IAM credentials are what define those connections. And people are just still thinking of them as more like human identities and kind of naively understanding the implications.
Yeah. Okay. So follow-up question on the bucket policy, the resource policy. So, I think Amazon has done a really good job over the last little while trying to, if you're in the console, and I know as much as people talk about, automation and things like that, you still routinely end up in the console at some point. So they've done, I think, a pretty good job at trying to make things more visually obvious if you've got a bucket misconfigured or something like that. So even with all of those things, I know S3 still comes up in the news every once in a while. Why do you think that folks are still not setting up things like this idea of multiple levels of security down into like a resource policy or a bucket policy? Why do you think that's still getting overlooked?
Well, I think my perception is there are probably a few reasons. One is the press often reports on S3 exploitations as somebody left a bucket open to the world, when often that is not what happened. And this creates a false sense of security when combined with the, I think, badly named feature block public access. So if the calculus in my head is, well, if I don't have public buckets, I'm okay, because that's how people are getting these data exfiltrations are happening to them. And there's a feature called block public access. If I turn that on, I won't be vulnerable to what's getting people in trouble. And that's not really true. So very often what we see are S3 exploitations where somebody is one way or another gaining credentials that have access to particularly list and read S3 on S3 buckets that are not just public buckets. And then also block public access. I mean, you can have that turned on and happy and have half the internet have access to an S3 bucket through CIDR block allocations. So I think there is a desire, and I teach a lot of classes too, and on cloud security, and very often I'll get questions like, and I'll be drilling into like how you have to think about this whole problem and how complex it is, and people say, well, isn't there just a configuration that'll work? And I'm like, no, I'm sorry. It depends on your use case, and you really have to understand this stuff.
Yeah.
So, people like easy buttons. If you're thinking there's an easy button for this, you're in trouble. And I think AWS made a mistake by naming that block public access, because it implies an easy button.
That you do that and you're done.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So but I want to ask you about IAM in particular, but you said something about teaching a lot of classes. So why don't we talk a little bit about that? Because I'm also a fan of those. So why don't you just let us know kind of what it is that Fugue and you are doing? I think you call them master classes, right? Security master classes or something like that.
We do.
Okay.
Yes.
Why don't you just, let's talk about those a little bit. And I'm just, I know about them. I've attended a few, but for the folks that are either listening to us right now or maybe watch this recording later on, why don't you tell them a little bit about what those are and why you think they're so important?
Sure. So my co-founder and marketing minded colleague said we should call these master classes. I was a little shy about that, but so far they've worked out pretty darn well. I mean, I've spent over a decade now of everything I've been doing is focused on cloud security, and so I've learned some things. And I think in particular, I've learned, this like kind of the 10,000 hours thing. Once you've done something long enough, you develop almost like instinctive reactions to things and the ability to have an intuitive understanding. So what I'm trying to teach in these classes is not, here's a list of bad stuff and here's a list of good stuff, although we do some of that. I'm really trying to teach people how to think about these problems. Okay. And how to kind of grok how to solve them for themselves. And so that's what we mean by a master class, is giving you the tools. And often those are mental models of breaking down the problem space so that you can reason about it and so that you can communicate about it. So we do topics covering from, well, we have got a couple on how to make it a secure S3 bucket. Yeah. That's one.
Yeah.
We've got a few on IAM. We're about to do a whole series on infrastructure as code. And there we'll be talking about things like when you're checking infrastructure as code at the template stage, but the template is going to be interacting with infrastructure that was built elsewhere. Often it is the interactions that can create security vulnerabilities. And so just understanding what you're actually getting by doing this and how to do it. So that was our idea. And we don't talk much about Fugue in these. It's not about our product, really. I mean, I'll use it to demo certain concepts, but yeah, we're really just trying to, make the cloud a more secure place. And, the other fun thing is I'll often meet people who are starting out in their careers, and then we'll touch base on LinkedIn and I can try to help them. And,
Yeah, that's good. Yeah. I've watched a couple of the replays, I think, for a few of them, and they're I've been doing specifically AWS for a long time now. And one of the things I think that I've always loved about this platform is that there's always something new to learn, right? Like you can think that you know service X really well, and then you're just having a conversation or listening to somebody else, and they just say one or two little things that you kind of have that, oh yeah, okay, why did I not think of that kind of moment? So it's always great to listen to other people talk, and there's lots of different ways to solve problems, and you may be kind of looking at it one way and not realizing there's maybe a better way to do something. So yeah, they're really great resources.
Awesome.
Let's talk about identity and access management, because I think we do some audit work for our customers, and it's, generally we find IAM is an afterthought. I have my own personal reason why I think it's an afterthought, but I'd love to get your take on, what are some of the biggest challenges, particularly around IAM, and maybe what you're seeing people kind of struggle with there as well.
So I think that the biggest challenges around IAM are, it's intimidating, and it is intimidating for good reason. It is extraordinarily complex to understand and practice. And I think there are a couple of design decisions that are, and by the way, I think these were good design decisions. The complexity has to reside somewhere. It's like the second law of thermodynamics, right? Complexity is not going away. It's just going somewhere else if something's simple.
Yeah.
So you eventually have to confront it. The choice that AWS made to deal with complexity, or obviously there were many, the relevant one to IAM, in my view, is the proliferation of what are called actions, and the association of IAM permissions specifically to those actions, and there not being meaningful hierarchies of actions. So, for example, in EC, what I mean by action is like, S3 list buckets. It's the API commands, okay?
Yep.
And I think of AWS I think of it as a flat taxonomy, not divided by service, of all the actions available. That's my mental model for AWS. It's just a long list of stuff that can be done. So the actions are the verbs. So in EC2 alone, there are over 400 actions in EC2. Now, when you're creating an IAM policy, so there's that wall of denial, right? The default policy is deny everything. Good, excellent design. And then you're poking allowances through it. Allow this, allow this, allow this. Well, when you're looking at EC2 alone with over 400, you're really tempted to just say, well, all the read stuff is okay. And that gets you in massive trouble, because a lot of read operations, hackers are explorers and discoverers primarily. 90% plus of hacking is discovery. And listing and reading is how you do it in the cloud via APIs. So I think that this is a kind of fundamental problem to cloud. It's not going to get simpler. It's going to get more complex. And there are interactions between, dependencies rather, between these actions too. So, you might need like 4 of them across 2 services to do one practical thing. So this is quite intimidating. I think the answer has to be, in the long run, tooling. I don't think it's a reducible kind of complexity, but I do think that you can have aids and abstractions. Humans are really, really bad. We're really good at abstraction. We're really bad at remembering lists. And so when you have 400 actions on EC2, that kind of plays to our weakness.
Yeah. And then you have to think about, 165-ish plus services, and then they all have their own actions, like the verbs as you described, right? And there's an extensive list. I was smiling as you said that, because we try to take that approach where just deny by default is your friend, to your point, right? And then only add the absolute minimum you need to do to, the actions that you need to perform whatever operation is that you need. that's great, right? But it takes patience. It takes lots of reading of documentation. And I think the challenge that we hear from a lot of folks that we talk to is our timelines are so tight that I can't spend the time with 400 actions to figure out what are the 4 that I need, because, you know, the product has to be delivered yesterday. And I think that's kind of a little bit of a double-edged sword with public cloud in general. It's not specific to AWS, is that it's always been sold as get there faster. And by getting there faster, you have to make trade-offs, right? So in order to get that product running now, I need to maybe oversimplify my IAM actions in order just to get this done. So I think a lot of times that we find customers just kind of running into a situation where they're unable or unwilling to spend the time that it takes to do that properly. And then they end up with holes in their environment.
I'm afraid.
Oh, are we having technical difficulties?
Okay, now. Are you inside? Are you able to hear me?
There, I can hear you now. Yeah, you're back. Your video is a little choppy, but audio is coming through okay.
Okay, let's hope it's
intermittent, maybe.
Okay, let's.
Oh, I might have lost you again.
Let's hope it stays that way. I appear to be having.
Oh, you still there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Yeah, you're coming and going. Why don't we do this? I'm going to turn off your video for now, and we'll see if that cleans it up for now. How's that? And I'm going to made any difference, did it?
No, I'm going to try switching networks on my side altogether to another network I have.
Okay, let's see what happens.
Okay.
We'll give it a second. You're kind of cutting out still.
I'm coming.
Yeah, I think you might be completely frozen on us now.
1, 2, 3.
Can you still hear me like that, Josh? Does that work? Here, let me turn off. I'm going to turn off my video as well, and we'll just go like this.
Hear me?
There, I can hear you again. Can you hear me okay?
Okay.
Maybe
I can hear you fine.
Okay. Maybe we'll leave video off and just see if
trying
that
to get
it.
Yeah, and I just switched to another network, so maybe it'll be better now. Let's give it a minute to stabilize here.
Yeah, sure.
All right. So I think I heard what you were saying. That the timelines on cloud prevent that truly least permissive use of IAM because of the complexity. Is that a fair?
Yeah, I think that's it in a nutshell. I don't know if you would agree with that or not.
Oh yeah, I do.
Yeah.
I think that happens all the time. And the other thing that folks don't realize is even if you really craft your IAM roles and policies, and of course you should, to be least permissive, there are things that can happen where more permissive policies are used against your resources. And this is why I was focusing on, S3 bucket policies, because let's say you've created this very, capable, narrowly focused S3 access IAM policy that, doesn't allow listing and only allows reads. And, you're just doing all the best practices and you're getting your keys from a database instead of from S3 list commands, stuff like that. Well, there is still in that AWS account an S3 policy, an IAM policy out there with lots and lots of S3 permissions. Yeah. So if a bad guy gets in, if a hacker gets in and decides and finds a way to co-opt that more permissive policy, you're in trouble.
Yeah.
And that's where the resource policies can really help.
So really what we're talking about here is multiple levels of protection wherever it's possible, which is really no different than what we've done outside of cloud for ages, right? Like it's great to have an identity policy, but what if, right? So in the event that a service like S3 or SQS, or I can't think of another one off the top of my head, but the services that have the ability to layer in with a resource policy, then your activity or your work really doesn't end at an identity policy. Then it becomes a resource policy as well.
Well, yeah, because, you know, and I think you're right. We are talking about layered defense. The layered defense in the data center was largely network and operating system based. The layered defense in the cloud is largely policy based.
Mm-hmm.
And so you've got the default deny. Well, the default deny applies both for principals using actions, right? But it also applies to principals talking to resources. So by default, both of those things are denied, and you can think of those as layers. And you need to consider both of those layers. And then, of course, you can assert at a resource level. You know, you can even do things like in S3 buckets. You can say, unless the connection is coming from this VPC endpoint, don't allow anyone in. Then even S3 admin is not going to be able to go and talk to that S3 bucket. So complicating it too is depending on how you've chosen to do these things. There are lots of different strategies you can employ on how to do these layers of security, but they're kind of in an unfamiliar world. So attribute based, tag based permissions are really powerful. However, if you're going to use attribute based, you have to really limit who can write tags, right?
Yeah. And I think the other challenge, I think the attribute based is kind of the way to go, like thinking about tagging resources. But I think it's also a big challenge because, Amazon's constantly modifying the platform, adding features, and tagging is kind of in my brain. And I don't know if this is a right assumption or not, but the way that I've always thought about it is whether or not a service allows tags. Tagging, like IAM, tends to be an afterthought. So what you end up running into is a situation where nothing is tagged or there's not a common set of tags. I love the idea of doing that attribute-based access control, but that again is challenging in some cases because the timelines are so short. People just say, well, we'll tag later. And then you end up in a situation where you have a ton of resources spread across multiple accounts that you have to tag. And then that also means going back now and looking at the policy statements that you've created, because without that tagging policy in place at the beginning, you don't have tag-based policies, right? So it's challenging. I think AWS is doing the right things. If you've gone so far down the path without some of these features, though, or knowing that it's possible, it does become challenging to kind of go back to that fork in the road and change course.
There's, as you were talking, I'm reminded of a really great John Carmack lecture I watched once. And he was expounding on the benefits of a very what most people consider a very strict programming language called Haskell, and he made the comment that if something will compile, it will end up in your code base. and I'm going to say on cloud, what that means is if something can be done in cloud, it's probably in your environment. Mm-hmm. The belief that human policy can resolve these things, I think, is incorrect. So what you need to do then is okay. Let me rewind for a sec. So I'll talk to folks who say the only way our cloud ever gets touched is through approved CI/CD pipeline changes via Terraform or CloudFormation.
Yeah,
nobody touches it otherwise. I have never found that to be true. I have found many people to believe that, but I've never found it to be true. Yeah. And when you are let's say, ABAC, attribute-based access control, is a newer feature. Well, you almost certainly, if you've been doing cloud for a while, have stuff that was not designed with that, even if you think you're using that everywhere. So the broad point is, you have to have a strategy. You have to have an architecture for security in your cloud, and that involves decision-making and expertise and so on. But you also have to assume that even when you put that in place, it is you are inheriting a lot of things that don't have it, and that a lot of things are currently happening that aren't following it. And so discovery, contextual discovery, becomes really probably the most single important thing about cloud security. Knowledge, and it has to be contextual knowledge. Humans, again, are really bad at lists of things. This is why we visualize everything. To give you a diagram and paint stuff red that's dangerous. Yeah, and I don't, people blame the cloud service providers. Like, why did they not simplify this for us? And the answer is because they gave us so much capability.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Finish your thought. Go ahead.
No.
I was just going to say, like, I like this analogy of a bucket of Lego. Essentially, that's what the cloud providers have provided to us, right? Is a big bucket of Lego that represents the services and what you can do. And then it's up to you to assemble those bricks in the most appropriate way and in different ways to be able to build whatever it is that you're trying to create. So in order to build or provide a platform like that, they do have to the right phrase isn't to leave it open, because that's not what they're doing, but they have to give you that flexibility, which then introduces the complexity that we've been talking about.
Exactly.
Yeah. So let's go back to something else that you said there about contextual discovery, and this idea of being able to visualize resources, assets that are in these environments. I know just for myself, like, we draw pictures of everything, and they might just be scribbled on the back of a napkin at the beginning, but looking at a picture is a far easier way to understand what it is that you may be trying to create or what it is that you currently have. Is that kind of a good example of the tooling that still needs to sort of be created? Maybe there's some products out there that are good at this. Can't think of anything off the top of my head, but is that the type of tooling that still needs to be created, whether it's by a third-party solution or by one of the cloud providers, like natively on the platform? Is that something that you think would help?
Well, I definitely think it would help, and that's why we've spent years building that. So the first thing that Fugue is going to do, and I'm not here to just plug my product, but you asked me. So
yeah,
I'll tell you.
Go for it.
The first thing we'll do is we have a guarantee, actually, that in 15 minutes of giving us an IAM permission to look in your AWS, and we do Azure and Google as well, we're going to give you a diagram of all of your cloud infrastructure down to the resource level with all of the security vulnerabilities. And that discovery tool becomes where people start to learn about, really where they're exposed. And one of my favorite G2 reviews of our product starts with, Fugue is going to hurt your feelings. It's a very positive review, but what he meant is, we're going to find a bunch of things that you thought were okay. Yeah. And that's the beginning of that journey. So I don't know, the cloud service providers might do some of this at some point. We've spent a long time on it ourselves, and it's definitely needed. It's really hard to do it with Visio or a Sketchpad.
Well, because of the dynamic nature of the platform, right? Like,
yes.
What if you draw a picture of it now, to your earlier comment about people making assumptions that nobody touches the infrastructure unless it goes through approved CICD pipeline. Well, that's just not the case, right? So if somebody has a mechanism to step around that and they want to do something really quickly, they will. So by the time you've drawn that diagram, it's most likely no longer an accurate representation of what's there. Right.
Exactly.
By the time you're finished. Yeah. Let's talk a little bit more about the CI/CD pipeline, because I think it's an interesting part of not only building and maintaining infrastructure, but ensuring the ongoing security of that while it's, during life cycle. So before it's built to when it's running to when you retire it. Could you talk a little bit about, let's stay on this idea of challenges, but what would be some of the biggest issues that folks are running into when they're trying to think about a pipeline solution for, let's say, building out infrastructure and services within the platform?
So, yeah. So where I've seen this evolution over, I've been at this for a while. The most mature organizations that are truly using CI/CD pipelines for their infrastructure have developed a lot of expertise with, CloudFormation or Terraform on AWS, for example. That's a required prerequisite to really having your CI/CD pipeline reflect what's going on in your infrastructure. So put another way, if you're running a CloudFormation template on day 1, and then on day 30, and again on day 45, you're going in either with scripts or at the console or the CLI and tweaking things, and it not coming back around into your CloudFormation template, that template no longer describes what is in that infrastructure, which is an important desired state of a real CI/CD pipeline, right?
Yeah.
And there are things that are difficult to do using infrastructure as code tools, and there are things to do that are impossible to do with infrastructure as code, that are not available via infrastructure as code. So this is the kind of perennial dilemma. It's not dilemma. It's like the perennial annoyance of doing a CI/CD pipeline, which is, by the way, the right thing to do. Is you can't then forget about other things, right?
Yeah.
But you can do most of it through there. I think baking, the beauty of cloud from a security perspective, which is what I spend most of my time thinking about, is it's the first time in the history of computing that we can really apply computer science to the configuration and safety of infrastructure, because it's all exposed via APIs. So that gives us this new unique ability to, for example, check your Terraform or CloudFormation template before it is executed for certain violations, the ones you can catch pre-deployment, and then through a CI/CD pipeline have security checking built in the dev environment post-deployment, and then also in the stage environment post-deployment, and as a pre-check going to production. So there's all kinds of really cool capabilities there, but it is a fair amount of work.
Yeah, I think this goes back again to what we talked about earlier on, is, the fact that this does take effort, it does take expertise. And if you're on a very short or tight timeline, sometimes that upfront effort gets pushed to the side in order just to get something done.
Yes.
Yeah, it's challenging. So I read a report lately or earlier on. I can't remember who it was by now, but the number was something like, it was well over 50% of organizations that would say they are using infrastructure as code in an automated way, are finding that in order to remediate security issues within their environment, they're stepping around the pipeline in order just to fix it. And a couple little comments that I pulled out of the report were, it's just too complicated or it takes too long. So let's talk a little bit about the first part of that, complication. When you hear somebody say it's too hard to remediate, it doesn't matter really if it's a security issue, but let's talk about security. It's too hard to remediate a security issue that we found post-deployment through the pipeline. What would your response be to them? Like, how do they fix, or how do you think about removing that complexity in that scenario? Because really it should be going through the pipeline, again, to your earlier comment, because if it's not in the pipeline, if it's not in those templates, then you don't have an accurate representation of what's actually there. So what would you say to those people that say it's just too complex?
So I would say that most things are not. Like if you're talking about just turning on, making sure you have, encryption turned on Elastic Block Store, or making sure certain ports are not open via security groups, these little isolated problems, which frankly, most security tools, that's all they tell you about, are these really kind of simple problems. Those are really easy to tweak back in the template, just usually by changing, a couple of configuration items. And so it's worth just getting in the discipline of doing that. I think a lot of the complexity comes in organizationally, not technologically, where those templates might be owned by another team than the one, for example, that's looking at production. And that might play back to the takes too long. In the more, what we see a lot of now are, because people have used, whether it's the AWS tools, or maybe they use the Palo Alto stuff at some point, they've caught a lot of their like really glaringly obvious security issues, like, a public S3 bucket. But what we're catching now with Fugue anyway are these complex interaction kinds of security flaws. Like, for example, you have an EC2 instance that has an IAM role that allows the EC2 instance to change its own IAM policy. You have to know about IAM and EC2. In many organizations, the infrastructure as code templates for the EC2 instance and for the IAM policies are going to be owned by different teams. And that's where you can get into some real complexity too. My advice would be, fix stuff quickly, however you can, to triage the situation, to just not get hacked, and then go and figure out how to get it back into your IAC, and through the pipeline correct it. Unless, if you can't immediately fix it through the pipeline, go ahead and fix it manually or however you want to, and then go use the time you bought to fix it through the pipeline to keep your templates up to date, because otherwise you really have, in the long run, a huge mess. You're never going to know whether or not what you're running is reflected by your code that's checked in and operated on by the CICD pipeline.
Yeah. So I would say that we spend the vast majority of our workday creating CloudFormation templates for folks. That's kind of what we do. And I would agree with you, as much as we say to our customers, once this is deployed, this is how you manage it, right? You go into whatever tool that you want to use, whatever editor you want to use, you make a connection to the repository. Again, doesn't matter what that tool is, and you change the code there, and it goes out through the pipeline. And that's a great way to think about it. And the way that we always say is that should be your default, unless things are really going sideways on you really, really quickly. And to your earlier comment, like, as long as you have the discipline to say, this is a serious issue and we need to fix it now. As long as you have the process in place to say, okay, somebody can go in and manage that. We'll use a really simple example. There's just a horrible inbound rule in security group. Just close it, right? But then the process needs to be in place to say, okay, once that person's done that work, how do we make sure that the template is updated, repushed, so that it reflects the actual environment? And I think what's happening, this is the problem that I think is existed forever, is the documentation is always the next thing on the roadmap to get done. Updating the template once you've changed something manually is always the next thing that I'll do when I have some time, and then it never gets done. So I think, I love the idea of just remediate the issue, remove or limit or reduce the possibility of getting hacked, but then having that process in place, give that person the time to go back and work on the template to fix it properly and get it deployed so that it's in all the environments and it looks exactly the same everywhere.
Yeah, I agree with everything you're saying there. As you know, Brett, early days of Fugue, we were kind of pioneering ways to avoid this whole problem space by use of real language, real programming language, type systems, things like that. And the market really wanted that quicker, easier approach that things like CloudFormation and Terraform represent. But the cost of that quickness has been, so for example, in Terraform, it is really easy to confuse the state file.
Yeah.
It is just really easy to do that. And that's because it just wasn't that thoughtfully implemented up front. It assumed that the AWS identity of whatever resource was, like security group, for example, was fulfilling what the template asked for, that the identity, the ID would stay the same, which we know in practice is not always the case. And so there are these additional layers of complexity. And that's why I think perhaps people are starting to realize that remediation that way can be tricky. I very much agree with what you're saying around, that you really want to update those templates, but you also don't want to get hacked in the interim. So finding that sweet, the middle ground, I suppose.
Yeah. I think a lot of times, and again, this has been around forever. It's not necessarily always a technology problem, right? This is a person or people problem about making sure that, number one, there's proper communication in place between the teams. Because to your point, right, on a small team, you probably have one or two people that are doing all of that, which is nice, right? In the fact that you can hopefully quickly remediate it. But in larger organizations, multiple teams are going to be working. And if those teams aren't communicating properly, then there is increased lag from the time you find that issue to when it gets created. So it's really, or when it gets remediated. So it's not really a technology challenge, I would say. I think it's really people and process and communication internally.
Yeah, I agree with that. I do think the technologies that the market has chosen have exacerbated it to some degree by, people don't actually want to deal with complexity, and so they'll tend to defer it. And as I said earlier, in my view of the world, the universe has a principle of conservation of complexity. It's accumulating somewhere.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah. It's just not obvious where it is because you're avoiding eye contact with it until
that's right.
Something gets really bad.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's kind of the thing we're trying to disentangle now. And I think that, this is why I keep coming back to actually understanding what's happening out there in a meaningful way, in a human understandable way is critical. And then having, as you point out, those lines of communication. I've often seen scenarios as well where cloud resources and configurations are being shared across teams, even by policy, like thou shalt use this, Terraform template for your VPC network or this CloudFormation template, and it doesn't meet the need of the local team. And so exceptions are made, which are necessary for, the thing to work, the system to work. Time goes on, that new kind of forked template is forgotten about, and is picked up by some third team because, hey, this one does what we need it to. There are all kinds of these scenarios. And that's why it's really important to not believe your templates, but to constantly look at the reality of the cloud infrastructure environment and be updating your templates to reflect the evolved reality.
Yeah. I like that. I like that example again, because we see a lot of people, and we do this, right? Like we've got kind of the single source of truth. If you want a VPC, this is the starting point. But we understand that just because that worked for project A doesn't mean that it's going to work for project B. It might get you 3/4 or hopefully more of the way there, but project B needs something slightly different. The challenge, to your point, is exactly that. If the next person just goes to the project B team and says, give me what you've created, now you're slowly deviating further and further away from that single source of truth. And if you're not monitoring and watching what's changing in those environments, project C doesn't actually need that port open or a slightly different permission set. Now they've introduced what project B needed into project C, and nobody knows it's even there. So
yes.
Again, it's those are really challenging things to deal with if you don't have that ability to understand, to your comment about discovery, right? Understand what's there right now, not what is in the template, because that template, as much as we want to say that's the single source of truth and the template is your documentation, it's probably not always the case.
Well, the very architecture of the cloud prevents that from being the case, unless you do some pretty I mean, so at Fugue, we've always believed that there should be a bidirectional connection between resources and how those resources have been built. So, for example, if you go and look at a cloud infrastructure account, can you say which Terraform template that container came from?
Mm.
No.
Yeah.
The short answer is no.
Yeah.
So without that, you don't know the provenance of things and the provenance of the configuration. Now, one thing we have built into Fugue, and this is from the very earliest days, is for those resources where you don't want the team to have the option to go around the pipeline, Fugue has the ability to say, okay, what just went through the CICD pipeline, for example, for these security groups, shall be enforced. Fugue, don't let them mutate, and alert us if they mutate any way that's out of band. Now, you're not typically going to want to do that for everything in your cloud infrastructure, because some things, for example, the ability to, I don't know, spin up compute instances or containers or Lambdas, you might still want. But for a lot of things, that self-healing capability that we've baked into the product will solve for a lot of this kind of issue if the processes of the team are mature enough to accommodate it. And that's really the challenge, right? Technologically, we can do this stuff. Well, at least Fugue has done this stuff. But very often we hear teams say, well, I can't do that, then I won't be able to fix stuff. And it's like, well, then you might think about how you're operating your pipeline and so on. But we don't try to make a hard line on it. What we do is we report to them that the mutation occurred and how it occurred, and then as an alert, and then they can decide what to do about that. And we provide documentation on how to fix that in the code. So,
yeah, almost like a run book, right? Once you see this, these are step 1 through X in order to remediate it after the fact. Yeah, that's
exactly.
good. Yeah, that's very good. I know we're coming to the top of the hour here. We've got about 10 minutes. There is one last thing I want to ask you about, and it goes back to, I think, something that we've talked about a couple times here, and it's, the infrastructure as code in general. I know that it's important. I consider it to be kind of a holy grail type thing. I cut my teeth in the monitoring space, and there was always this idea of single pane of glass, right? That's what we were always working towards. And I think a lot of people have this idea that potentially infrastructure as code can be like that. But you mentioned shortcomings, right? There are just certain things that you can't do regardless of the tooling that you're using, whether it's something native on the platform or a third-party solution. What do you see as kind of the biggest gap in the ability to use infrastructure as code as kind of the single source of truth within your environment? Like what is the thing that's missing there that you can't do right now that is kind of a bit of an Achilles heel?
Well, I mean, I think the biggest thing and I'm a software architect by an engineer by trade, so I tend to think in systems terms. The biggest issue in my view is the lack of that ability to understand provenance and inheritance, right?
Yeah.
If you cannot associate a resource to an IAC template via a compute mechanism, right? Via an automated mechanism. If there's no data that connect those things together, then a human has to connect them together. And that means that we're back to human knowledge being part of that single source of truth. Obviously, humans invented the idea of truth, but we're not good at enumerating complete truths. We're not good at saying, here's the list of 72,000 things in my AWS and how they got there. And I think that's kind of a fundamental problem with how IAC has been implemented. both by the cloud native solutions and by, you know, HashiCorp and others,
Mm-hmm.
is this belief that, well, if we're keeping track on the IAC side, that's good enough, when actually I don't believe that it is. I mean, there are certain features in cloud too that, so if you imagine your entire cloud account, so Fugue manages millions of cloud resources for our customers. We have these very, very large environments. You know, SAP NS2 use Fugue. Red Ventures, you know, they acquired CNET and brought the whole CNET property into Fugue in an afternoon. And so we're able to look across vast quantities of infrastructure to understand issues. Now, if you think about what is the collection of IAC, even assuming for a moment that everything in a 500,000 resource cloud environment with 150 or 500 accounts, if you assume everything was built by IAC, the notion that you could, by looking at some versions of all of those templates and understand the whole picture, you're probably talking about an unreasonable number of templates that are going to have operated at different versions at different times. And so there's no kind of central source of truth, because the source code is really an artifact of a particular time and a particular scope. So I think that's a fundamental problem that can be resolved, but requires coordination between the cloud service providers and IAC tooling.
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah. Well, this has been fantastic. I think I don't know if I said it while we were live or said it before when we were chatting. You know, it's great to talk to other people, because you always just take that one or two things away from a conversation and just add it to your knowledge, and you know, go off and learn about the platform, whichever platform you've chosen. So I really appreciate it. Thanks very much. I do have two kind of follow-up questions, and I gave you these ones up front. So I'm hoping that you've maybe thought of a couple things. Just this idea, we talk internally all the time about being continuous learners, right? These platforms are big, they change so fast. You have to be a continuous learner in order to, I think, still provide value to your customers, right? Because they're relying on you. So we read a lot. You know, if we're not building something, we're reading about what other people are doing, smart people are doing, and trying to figure out how we can use that for our customers. So my question is really, what are one or two things that you're reading right now that you find important? They might not necessarily be directly related to computing. It could be something else. I'm always interested to know what's on people's Kindles or however you decide to read nowadays.
Yeah, so I've got two answers. One is a computer, you know, book, and the other is not, but I think very important for our time and industry. I'm actually doing my annual reread of SICP, the Structure and Interpretation of Computer Programs, which is an old book, but one that I think is very profound. It's actually a Lisp book. But if you're thinking about doing things like so-called serverless or function-based computing, you know, we build Fugue largely with Lambda. Understanding functional programming is incredibly important. Whether or not you're writing in a functional language like Lisp or Haskell, I mean, we're mostly a Go shop, which is not an FP language, right? It's a procedural language. But understanding the concepts behind FP and how to compose using FP style concepts is really important to modern distributed architectures. And I just enjoy. I always learn something new by going back through this old MIT book, and so I do it. Yeah, I try to do it like once a year or so. The other book I'm working on is called The Sword and the Shield, which is a sort of combined biography of Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X, and explores the interaction of these two intellectuals and you know, thought leaders, to use our industry's term, around the Black civil rights movement and where they came from and how they were thinking about it and so on, and how their lives played out. And I think this is a time when everyone in this country should really be spending some real time focus there. So those are my 2 current reads.
Awesome. Well, thank you for sharing. And then my final question before we wrap up is, if you could, give us 1 or 2 people that you would say would be a good fit for this show, interesting to talk to about technology and how people are building on these platforms, whether it's AWS or something else. Can you think of 1 or 2 people that we should have on here and chat about things with?
A couple come to mind, but I want to make sure with them first before I announce something publicly that you should go pay them.
Fair enough. So I'll bother you later then about that, because
bother me later.
I'm always love to talk to interesting people and people that are smarter than me on how they're thinking about things, because as I mentioned a couple times, there's always opportunities to learn something new. So thank you very much. I appreciate it, your time today. It's a shame that we had some technical difficulties, but hey, that's the nature of the beast. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. It's been really fun. I've learned some things too, and we're hiring. So go to fugue.co if you're a software engineer or a good solutions architect, and send us a line.
Perfect. Thanks very much, Josh.
Okay, thanks.
Take care.
You too. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye-bye.